Hello, everybody. Welcome. Bienvenidos. It's so great to see you. Thank you for joining us, whether it's the morning or the afternoon or the evening, wherever you are. My name is Ed Finn. I'm the director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. I'm also the editorial director of Future Tense, and we're really delighted to present this conversation today and to share this project we've been working on for years, and really excited to bring it to you all and to the world. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. So we're presenting the Climate Action Almanac, which is a new book available for free to read, to share. We'll share the website for that. It's just climatealmanac.org. And a little later, we're going to be speaking with some of our contributors and collaborators on this project. But I want to take a moment to talk about the inspiration for this. This started in 2011. And in a lot of strange and surprising ways, emerged in conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic. We had an event in 2021 where we started talking about positive climate futures. We were inspired by Kim Stanley Robinson, who is very graciously going to join us in this conversation in a couple of minutes. The impetus was, how do we start telling stories about the futures that we want? How do we break out of the often really anxiety-inducing conversations about climate change, the seeming intractability and complexity of it, the way that it's moving really slowly and then all of a sudden happening really quickly, and start to have conversations about what our futures are going to look like, what stories we can tell about resilience and adaptation, and coming to terms with these changes that are, of course, happening to our planet, but also identifying the paths that we want to work towards. Because if we're going to motivate transformational change, if we're going to find our way as a species through all of the challenges of climate change, we need stories about what we want. We need stories about what we hope for. And those stories can't just be created by a tiny sliver of the population in North America and Europe. We need people around the world, communities around the world, to feel inspired and invited to imagine their own futures. So that was the inspiration for the Climate Imagination Fellowship, which we launched in 2011. And those writers and many other contributors have been working with us since then to put together this Climate Action Almanac, which, as with so many of our projects at the Center for Science and the Imagination, is intended to be just the starting point, an invitation to you and to others, we hope, to imagine new futures and to use these stories not as predictions or templates, but as provocations, thought experiments, and maybe hopeful glimpses of a world that we might actually want to live in. I also love the artwork and all of the creative things that we have shared as part of this. We worked with a Brazilian artist named João Queiroz to make some really beautiful images. If you'd like to send somebody a postcard from the future, you can do that at the Climate Imagination website. And we're sharing a few of those images now. And a little later, we're also going to be sharing a short film that we made to celebrate the launch of this book. So excited to spend the next 90 minutes with you and to talk to some of the people who inspired us and who helped make this whole thing possible. So I'd like to begin by welcoming Kim Stanley Robinson, who in many ways was the inspiration for this project and has been an inspiration for us for years. He's the author of more than 20 books, including the acclaimed climate fiction novels New York 2140 and The Ministry for the Future. He's a senior advisor for this project for us and participated in a dialogue for the Climate Action Almanac with Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who is the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He lives and works in Davis, California. Stan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ed. It's great to be with you. And I want to also, thank and in this session represent Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who was my teacher at COP26 and really a heroic figure in our current world culture.
Yeah, your conversation that you had with him was really tremendous and inspiring. So I want to start maybe with ministry, Stan. I've made this joke, I think, to you and to others that you've taken on a ministry of your own around the book. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what impact the book has had and how it's changed your life and the conversations you've started to have around the book, because there are very few people who have imagined hopeful climate futures with the kind of depth and global systems perspective that you do in the novel, really taking seriously this idea, well, how could we do it? What would a sort of a relatively good pathway for humanity be through the climate crisis? Maybe we could start there.
Sure. It's been 3 years, I think, since the book came out, and it's obviously being welcomed all around the world by readers to an extent that is perpetually astonishing to me. And I think it's because of this thing that ASU has sponsored with its program also, Positive Climate Futures. Now, there's a very fine line there to keep, because we are actually in a supremely dangerous situation. So to portray the future in positive terms has to be reconciled with being realistic about where we are and how dangerous the moment is. And I've been a utopian writer for my entire career, or at least the last 3 decades of it. I keep coming back to utopian futures and trying to write positive futures for humanity in general, usually focusing on politics. But the climate crisis has overwhelmed all that line of thought. And as a utopian coming to our current supremely dangerous moment, utopia has a new definition, and you might say a much lower bar. If we dodge an extinction event, a mass extinction event in this century, that's a utopian outcome. And there's another crucial aspect of that, which is equity. We can't do this without all humans being believing in it as the project of world history in our time. And so the injustices of past world history, which are partly causing the climate crisis, need to be solved at the same time as part of the coping with what many people call now the poly crisis, because there's so many different kinds of crises hitting us all at once now. Well, writing a book about that, it was hard and complicated in literary terms. It was a form problem, a genre problem. And I had tried it many different ways before. A realist novel set in Washington, D.C., that's a climate novel. The New York 2140, a kind of comedy of coping. And in ministry, I decided to put all my cards on the table and focus on what I think is crucial, the political, the economic, and imagine that we took the current world order, nation-state system, global capitalism, terrible tools, part of the problem, and use them anyway to create a better outcome. And that, I think, is what people have been responding to in the book. There is no magic. There are no superheroes. And I tried to make every single thing that happened in the book plausible enough to believe in while you're reading. And I also followed any good things that happened with bad things, because that's going to be the way it is. So this was the project, and something in it worked in an unusual way.
Yeah, it's very powerful, and I think a lot of people read the book seemingly who might not have thought of themselves as science fiction readers before, who didn't see the intersection between this genre of storytelling about the future and the very real problems that they might be working on because they're in policy or government or in industry. And clearly, the book resonated with a lot of those people. But one thing that struck me in the way you were talking about this right now is this idea that we need to believe that this future is possible. We need to believe that transformational change is possible. And I love an expression you use sometimes from Raymond Williams, the idea of structures of feeling. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this idea of what a global climate structure of feeling might look like, or what a change in that might look like.
I think we're in the change now. So then you change to what? Well, we're making it now. It's hard to characterize, but this is sort of the science fiction project to describe something that's emerging. And that's also Raymond Williams, the residual and the emergent. So there's lots that is residual from past human history and organizations, and some of that is good and some bad. And then new things are emerging. Some of them are good, and you can try to feature those. I focused on the political because it seems to me that now since the pandemic, in fact, everybody is aware that the biosphere can rise up and kill us. And that wasn't the same structure of feeling. There is a post-pandemic structure of feeling that is coming into being now. And that's why it feels like a ferment and a confusion. It's chaotic right now. The old order has died. This is Gramsci. The new order has not yet been born. We're in the interregnum now. And that's why your project there is so valuable, to try to talk about it, even guide it in good directions, positive directions. That for me, this always includes leftist directions, that there should be more public over private. There should be the commons rather than property. There should be government rather than business in terms of controlling human affairs. We should govern ourselves. We should govern our economy. We should regulate and incentivize, to use both sides of that dichotomy, to push ourselves, to pay ourselves to do green work rather than destructive, extractive, short-term work. So I've always been using that political orientation as a kind of a compass north in deciding what to do. Now, that's a structure of feeling for sure, but it's also just a political stance. I don't know how one reconciles the two. The two might be sort of the same, but maybe not. I think a structure of feeling is what all of us share as our shared understanding of what humans are and what we're all about. That is changes over time. And the political project is to maybe push the change to the next structure of feeling.
Yeah, one of the things that I've found with your work and other writers that we work with that makes it so powerful is that it allows us to feel our way into the future. So it's not just blueprints or the technological gizmos. And as you said before, we have all the tools now that we need to address this crisis. We don't need to invent a bunch of new technologies. Sure, they'll help and we'll make better solar panels and more efficient power transmission things and better batteries. But the changes that need to happen really are social changes. They're changes in our imagination of what we think is the right thing to do, how we value the world and how we value different kinds of behavior. And so that notion of and the science fiction stories are really powerful because they allow us to step into the lives of characters, to empathize with these fictional people living in this future, and then by extension, imagine ourselves in that future. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the, how we change that grammar. You've talked about some of the things that need to happen, in terms of policy, but how did you imagine characters in your story, and how does that what is the emotional side of futures work? Why is that so important?
Well, I love this question because it allows me to talk about the novel as an art form. And one of the things that's happened with ministry that has caused me to reflect on this is people come up to me and they're moved by the book. They've lived it. And I suddenly realized they've done at least half the work. A reader of a novel is looking at black marks on the page, and then things are happening in their mind and in their feelings that they themselves have created with an act of generosity and time that they've given to the book. And I love to read myself. I understand the impulse. But what's been interesting in the response to ministry is people will then afterwards ask me questions as if I were the novel or the minister in the novel. That willing suspension of disbelief has ballooned or not gone away. They're still willing to disbelieve the previous realism and believe in the reality of the novel as told to them. So I've gotten into bizarre and unbelievable situations of being asked to advise people I'm not competent to advise because they know more about these issues than I do. But then I can remember I can lead them into a session where they're allowed to imagine themselves and become science fiction writers for half an hour, and sometimes in a group session do this scenario building that's very valuable for them. But the reading of the novel has been the deep immersion. It's fictional, but it's real. You've had that experience. It's like every reader of novels gets to live 10,000 lives. if they can perform that act of imagination, and if they have the generous giving of time that they do. So I've seen it again and again in these last 3 years, and it pleases me greatly that the novel, which is kind of a 19th century form with famous delimitations on what it can represent and what it can't as an art form, it still has an enormous power if people will give their time to it and go into that the state of willing suspension of disbelief and say, I'm going to pretend to live this experience, and what will it teach me? And it still works, which is a beautiful thought when you're a lover of novels.
It's one of the great acts of collaborative imagination, isn't it? This marvelous thing that happens between you and your readers, and then everybody who's read the book can then, that talk. There's a community that forms around the book, around the story, and with some books like Frankenstein, other narratives that get told and retold over and over again, the story itself sort of comes to life in really interesting ways. So I think that connects to something you were saying earlier about that there's a lot of ideological overlap here, and since you mentioned Zaid and sort of representing him a little bit in this conversation, maybe you could talk a little bit about that conversation, the question of justice, right? And in your book, it is a utopian novel, but as you said, you imagine capitalism is the vehicle by which we have to make this transition, because that's what we exist in. The future is built out of the structures of the present. It's not like it's a clean slate. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the conversation and the sort of ongoing debates around climate justice and how we negotiate the facts of the past and the way that they shadow the present in the ways we imagine the future.
Yeah, thank you for that. Zaid is great. He was indeed High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights. And in that work, which he was a bulldog in that work, he fought for the powerless. It's inspirational. So I asked him, what was it like reading Ministry for the Future? Because that's why we met. He had read it. He liked it. What so much more about the refugee camps, which he'd visited often. And there's a big strand in Ministry of the Future about that very topic. What's going to happen to climate refugees? And if they try to escape to developed countries and get put into effectively concentration camps, in effect, or are not let out, what will it be like for them? And that already exists now. I could investigate it by a lot of reading and talking to people, but I'd never seen it. And Zaid had. What did you think of those scenes in the book? And he said, yeah, you got it right. People are still human there. They still make jokes. They still have hopes for their children. And so this, I think, is important to remember. And what I would want to add to that I've learned since my book came out, is that there's fear. Oh my gosh, people from the developing world, from the global south, will be cooked out of their home territories, and they'll come and invade us. And there's a nativist, anti-immigrant strain in the right-wing governments that are taking over in some nation states. Let's build a wall. Let's build a fortress country and not let them in, and we'll just still be ourselves. There's two things wrong with that. The world is made up of a mixed community. And the second thing is, those people, imagine immigrants, they're going to their countries are going to become uninhabitable. They're not going to move to your country. They're going to die in place. It's the middle class, the people who have enough money to pay human smugglers to get themselves to a developed country and try to survive there as immigrants. It's a tiny percentage of the population of these places. Most people don't have the wherewithal, and you cannot walk from South Asia to Germany. A middle-class hiker could do it over a period of months with support, but no, you can't do it. They will be stuck there, and they will live or die in place. So this immigrant thing is a bogeyman. It's a way to create fear in populations that are in the developed world, and they know they're relatively comfortable to people who are in the bottom 25%, the bottom 20% of human beings don't have access to clean water or toilets, much less electricity. So our situation is indeed dire and unjust and ugly. And so solving that as part of the climate solution, it gets called climate equity. There are organizations specifically devoted to making us and helping us to imagine what climate equity is, how it would be manifest in the world. And there's great work to be done there, because there are indeed solutions. If the developed world were not so miserly and not such a ridiculous cheapskate attitude towards money, which is a fiction and a social construct, if the developed world were to shift its financial resources into the global south and the hot world effectively, it would help to ease, it would help to create climate equity and ease the inequality that's in this world today. So the poly crisis includes that element in it. It could be used as a spur to action, to positive, equitable action, rather than to increasing misery and inequality. So the choices before us are stark, but the opportunities are there also. We just have to, part of the work that your project is doing, very important, is to diagram the situation in ways that people can understand what the stakes are and how to deal with them. It's a cognitive mapping process. And we need those cognitive maps really badly right now, because there are alternative cognitive maps that are, I would say, wrong and racist and ugly. So we have to provide the positive view going forward.
Really well said. And it makes me, you mentioned fear, and the incredible power that fear can hold. And that's where so many of those really dark stories about the future come from. And the opposite of that is hope. And I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of this conversation, that it's a fine line. It's dangerous because the climate crisis, the poly crisis, is really dangerous. And we can't just assume that it's all going to work out and we don't need to do anything about it. And so hope is really dangerous, but it's also this incredibly powerful engine. It's maybe the most human thing about humanity is our capacity to hope in the midst of the most abject, terrible circumstances. So I'd like to finish maybe by hearing you briefly reflect a little bit on hope and how you think of your work in relationship to hope.
I'm glad to finish on that. I think it's important. It's one could regard it as a religious attitude or a structure of feeling or a political position, but I want to say it's actually biological, that hunger is a hope. That at the cellular level, we hope to live and then we work towards it. But there's an urge to live. Life wants to live. And that is one definition of hope. You want to keep going. It's survivalist in a way, but it's also a hope. And you can structure it, because we have our basic animal feelings, but then we have structures of feeling that are linguistic and cultural. So Gramsci again, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Actually, I guess Romain Rolland said that first, but Gramsci made it famous. So pessimism of the intellect, I think it just means you need to be skeptical. You need to not succumb to cruel optimism where you just say everything is going to be all right. The situation is dire. So intellectually and rationally, and as scientists, one might say, because we all are we're part of a scientific culture. You look at the situation, analyze it, what needs to be done. Then optimism of the will. What's interesting about that is it takes will. You will your optimism or your hope. It's not, there are some lucky people who are biochemically optimistic or hopeful, glasses always half full. I'm one of those myself, thanks to my mom, but who was the same. But the will of it is you say, I don't care what my personal feelings are right now. I'm depressed, I'm scared, I'm full of dread. I will be acting as if hope will make a difference. I'm going to do things, and as representative of hope. So it's sometimes I've said it's just a club to beat your political enemies with, the fearful, the vicious, that your hope is a political club to fight within these battles, because it's going to be a wicked political battle that we're in. So this is my take on hope at this point. It's something you have to nurture and remember that it's important. It's also happening at the cellular level. It's a kind of hunger for your life and for your children's lives, for all the children's lives and the future generations in this kind of ministry for the future kind of sense. It's a political position that you take that I think makes you a leftist. There's a party of fear, that's the right, the nativist, populist, we are the only race that matters, we're the only people that matters. And there's the party of hope, which is roughly defined in 20th century terms as the left, but you could just call it the Hope Party or the Survival Party or whatever you like, the Human Party. From my perspective, that's the best way to describe it.
Well, thank you. That was really inspiring, Stan. And I think that we all need to practice hope, and we need to practice imagining the futures that we want, because otherwise we're never going to get there. And figuring out how to get better at that kind of collective and collaborative imagination is really important. And your work is really inspiring in that regard. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're gonna transition to our next bit here.
Okay, I'm going to leave and just say thank you to everybody, but especially to all the people at ASU running this project, and to all my colleagues. Thank you, and I'm off. I go. Bye bye.
Thank you, Dan. So let me welcome to your screens our next speaker, Jason Anderson, a senior program director at the ClimateWorks Foundation in San Francisco. Before joining ClimateWorks, Jason worked at the U.S. Department of Energy and Climate Action Network Europe. He has been a key collaborator and supporter throughout the development of the Climate Action Almanac. He wrote the books Afterward, and that connects climate storytelling with international climate politics and history. It was through that first conversation we had almost 3 years ago now, Jason, that this whole thing got going. We started talking about positive climate futures. So hello, nice to see you again.
It's great to see you, Ed. I'm really happy that this book is launched.
Me too. It's been a road, but the good things take time. So I wanted to ask you, coming from this background in climate policy and engaging, ClimateWorks supports all kinds of really important work around the world, as I call it, sort of in the trenches around climate change. And I wanted to ask, does climate policy need good stories? What is the relationship between storytelling and the more policy-driven work that ClimateWorks traditionally does, and what has inspired you about this project?
Yeah, well, as we've tried to develop positive policy and politics on climate change, we've seen the power of stories in the past, and sometimes these have been negative stories. So for a long time, there was this climate fiction that climate science was, exaggerated, maybe even a hoax. And that kind of story took root in a certain population and actually slowed down action in a lot of important places like the United States for a long time. So you can see what happens when there's a kind of a common understanding. And on the flip side, when you try to do something positive, you always hear again and again, the main thing that we need is political will, this kind of intangible substance that makes the world go around. And what is it exactly? Well, political will is this kind of common feeling about what the priorities are and what the impacts of taking a particular direction will be on the political health of candidates or parties, whatever it might be. So again, it's kind of a story people are telling themselves about what's important and what isn't important. And so being able to find a way of creating a basis for a climate story that also gains that attention has really been the work of decades. Initially kind of counteracting the it's not real, you get this science-based story, I'll call it, but it's really just relating the facts about what we're facing. And so there's trying to create this reaction. It's important. We need to have it on the agenda. But at a certain point, you also have to be able to turn it around and say, here's our positive agenda. Here's what we're trying to create, not just what we're trying to prevent. And that's a little harder because I think the negative is easy to construct. You see the power of negative images of, let's say, immigrants, as Stan was talking about, that creates whole political movements, whereas the positive side is a more complicated story to create.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that we've seen in conversations that we've had with policy experts. It's and it really in a lot of different sort of technical expertise in academia, it's actually much more risky to articulate a positive vision of something that you think we should work towards. It's safer to be a critic or to say, well, this is bad, we don't want this. That's a poorly constructed idea. It's sort of requires a certain kind of bravery or vulnerability to say, hey, I think we should do this. Can we agree on these things? And I guess I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how this works, how narratives of climate futures and climate action can affect climate policymakers.
Well, I think part of the kind of development of this has to do with the way climate policy and politics arose, which was largely down to a singular event, the creation of the UN Framework Conference on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, which has these annual COP events. And for a lot of years, I mean, I've been doing these for many years, and so I can remember a couple of decades ago, you would get this annual surge in attention on climate change around the time of the COP because there were world leaders there and a lot of press and so forth. And then it would really drop off. There would be, very little attention to climate between these events. And so it kind of was this gravitational pull to make it seem like there's only one thing that mattered. And year after year, the story would be, was there or wasn't there some kind of negotiated new target or something like that? And then, you would get this reproduced in countries. Did you or didn't you get this climate policy passed? And I think an interesting thing happened when Donald Trump was elected in the United States in 2016 and pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, which had been the big hope from that top level policy. The actual reaction to that was a massive groundswell of support for initiatives at every level of governance, from businesses, from cities, from states, et cetera, that sense that we are still in, even if you're not, we're still in. And ironically, what that did was, I think it really broadened the base of understanding about what people can do and who can tell these stories and take these actions. And so, it's not enough on its own to be able to create the kind of change that we need to do. But if you marry that with a more amenable top-level governance, with further international agreements, then you get that sense of, wait a minute, there's more than one story to tell here. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of geographies, a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's a sense at those higher level and the stage of global governance and the COP process and things like that, that those are stories that are too big for everyday people, right? That it's happening at some rarefied atmosphere. And I think that moment with the Paris Accords that you talked about, and also increasingly just the way in which climate impacts are stacking up everywhere, people are realizing, oh, this is a story that I need to be part of, and I'm already part of it. And I think that's one of the really powerful things about science fiction and speculative fiction is that it invites everybody into a possible future. So you don't have to be a policy expert. But even for the policy experts, there's no human alive has all of the different kinds of expertise that you would need to navigate the crises ahead of us, right? We have to work together. And so, the engineer says, well, I don't understand the legislative piece of this. And the policy person says, I don't understand the math behind this model. Everybody needs to get together. And the story invites everybody to have a shared conversation about what that future might be. So I want to wrap up by just asking, what are you hopeful about in the future of climate, and what do you hope will come out of this book and this project?
Well, I think the key word for me is agency. And I think Stan did a really good job of talking about that fine line between optimism and pessimism and where each is needed. The thing we have to not just be optimistic about, but recognize is that it is an innate human drive to take action, to move forward, to find options. And so we can't make people dispirited by a too blanketed pessimism about the future. We have to be realistic about what we're facing, but to give people the opportunity to take action at every level. And those people are largely people who were not the folks who got together in 1992 and wrote this framework convention. The population of the world is increasingly African, it's increasingly Southeast Asian, Latin American, a lot of young people in those parts of the world. So we need to be able to have their representation and their voices, as you see in the Climate Action Almanac, to be able to talk about what matters to them and to shift the priorities of the conversation now so that it actually meets the needs that they'll have in the future. And I'm really optimistic that that change is really starting to creep in now. We're starting to see that happen.
Yeah, I agree, and I feel the same way. Jason, thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, Ed.
So we're going to take a change mode a little bit now, and I'm really excited to share for the first time in public a short film that we've made. The Center for Science and the Imagination partnered with Sirens on a short film called The Assignment. Sirens is a creative team at the intersection of science and storytelling, focused on creating entertainment that encourages curiosity and imaginative thinking. They came and shot this with a number of ASU students and colleagues here at the Mix Center in Mesa, and we're really excited to share it with you all now.
What does it look like, this life you lead in the future? Your family? Your home? Luis. Luis.
Sorry.
The story should be between 1,200 and 1,500 words. And I want to see this future you live in through your words. I want you to give a full 360 view of 20 years in the future. Your future.
So, this is a horror story?
Right. Well, it's genre agnostic, but if that's your jam, why do you ask?
Our world is burning?
And nobody gives a crap, or is even doing anything real about it.
We're screwed.
Dystopia. The end of the world. Is the easy answer, right? Doom and gloom narratives remove your agency, makes it easier to disengage and lose hope. But the apocalypse is just one story. What's another? You're in the driver's seat for this assignment. You can rewrite the rules, the laws, well, not the laws of physics, but pretty much everything else. So stop scrolling and start searching. If we don't tell stories about the world we want to live in, how can we build it? Find your guide. They can come from anywhere.
We want to survive as humans, as a species, we want to thrive, but we need to change our ways of living and of doing things in order to not only survive, but thrive. Fungi started to send messages to moss. Mycorrhiza that connected with trees started to send messages to bees and beetles. They carry information that is essential to help to save life on Earth.
I'd like to share with youth around the world who are feeling frustrated or pessimistic about climate change that if human beings survived in the past, we can survive this time as well. As an urban planner, I saw increasingly unusual proposal for new city designs. The lower levels typically contained vegetable gardens, the middle levels housed garages and workshops, and the highest levels held power plants, water treatment plants, and similar machinery.
I think zooming in and seeing steps you can take, actually doing something kind of shakes off that feeling. You know, and imagine if we're doing that in little spots and pockets of places all over the world, which is happening already. Imagine if we're to do more.
Sometimes, some days, it felt like they were marking time. But every now and then there was a spark of something in the games children played, pretending to use dirt and leaves to power their tin vehicles.
And yet, the future is not written in stone. There are spaces, places, there are aspects which have not been filled in and cemented over. And it's in these uncertain spaces that the imagination can thrive. You need a network of stories, stories that talk to each other like patterns on a weave. This is why I collect stories from all the worlds to see if I can find the real ones, the true ones, and weave them with all the other people engaged in this task, weave them into something that can make a different world.
Can I weave your story into the web?
So for our last segment, really excited that we got to share that with you. We'll share links to that later if you'd like to send that out to other people as well as part of the project. Want to welcome three of our other contributors to the book and to the project, and I will introduce them now. First, Libia Brenda, who is an editor, writer, and translator based in Mexico City and a Climate Imagination Fellow for this project. She is part of the Cúmulo de Tesla Collective, a multidisciplinary art science working group, and the author of the recently published short story collection De Que Silencio Vienes. She wrote two pieces of fiction for the Climate Action Almanac, one of which was quoted in the film, Robots and Insects and Languages and Other Living Things, and Cosmic Fire, a novelette that she co-wrote with some members of Cúmulo de Tesla. Really excited to welcome Libia to the conversation. Also, Benjamin Ong, who is an ecologist, educator, science and nature writer, and development professional from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, exploring reconciliation ecology, human-nature connection, and tropical urban interstices. He wrote an essay for the Climate Action Almanac titled The Village Within, which is about creating more verdant and edible urban landscapes in hyper-modern cities through village aesthetics and traditions. And finally, Vandana Singh, an author of speculative fiction and a professor of physics at Framingham State University in Massachusetts, and a transdisciplinary scholar of the climate crisis, who is also a Climate Imagination Fellow. She wrote two pieces of fiction for the Climate Action Almanac: Three World Cantata, which is a novelette spanning global elites, immersive media, and the power of story, and Mina's Dream, which is about and the transformation of a suburban neighborhood in New Delhi, where Vandana was born and grew up. And Libya, I want to briefly gloss your stories because I didn't tell anyone what they're about. So Robots and Insects and Languages and Other Living Things is about intelligence to the vitality of non-human and beyond human worlds. And Cosmic Fire is about disaster. There might be a volcano, diaspora, recovery, and found family in central Mexico. I'm so excited to welcome you all here. Thank you for joining us. How are you all doing? I'm going to take that as that you're doing okay, even though your microphones are still muted. So I want to start with the premise of the project, which is that we wanted to tell stories from as many different parts of the world as possible, to bring in different communities and perspectives, because responding to climate is ultimately local and community and regional based as much as it is, something that happens at the national, internet or international level. So how can we bridge local climate action with global coordination? And maybe you can talk a little bit about, your contributions or, to how that touches on the work that you shared for our project. Maybe we'll start with Vandana.
Great. Well, put me on the spot. That is one of the most important questions that's before us, is exactly that, because, as Jason also indicated, for too long, the dominant discourse has been top-down and, obviously situated within a more elite paradigm that actually is out of touch with climate reality. And the people on the ground who are dealing not just with the climate crisis, but with the polycrisis and in all its forms, are the ones who are the experts in the experience of all of this. And yet they don't have a seat at the policy table, and they don't have, not only is their suffering not acknowledged, but it's also their agency, their creativity, their intelligence is not acknowledged. And so it's already happening in the real world in various marginal spaces that I hope will become more mainstream, that networks of grassroots movements or mini movements are being formed. I know that it's been done in India through the ongoing Vikalp Sangam project. It's being done through the global tapestry of alternatives. And it's also being done to some extent through the emerging bioregionalism movement, which is trying to talk beyond national borders, because, the problem with nation states is that, like corporations, they are always, they can't, examine themselves critically. And on top of that, nature does not recognize national boundaries. So I will just say this much, because I want to hear what others say on this question too, that it is a supremely important question, and that there are already movements towards it, and that once it reaches a certain threshold, it can start shifting the pyramid of power. So I'll stop there.
Ben, yeah, maybe you'd like to pick up from there. I'm especially thinking of the work in urban gardening and foraging that you've done. How does that question resonate with you?
Thanks, Ed. First, I want to say, Vandana, I really enjoyed your story, Mina's dream. It was it echoed a lot of things that I think about, but also in some ways have experienced in my own work. And building on something that you said about how nature does not recognize human boundaries, for instance, I thought it was an interesting way to lead in, because as I was listening to your conversation with Jason just a moment ago, I also reflect on how for quite a long time now I've been working in the space of policy/science social science, and it's very evidence driven in many ways, and it's also very human/anthropocentric in its outlook. But I think the experience of contributing a piece to the Almanac, as well as the kind of direction that I hope my work, for what it's worth, can inspire or even influence the work that happens in policy circles, will be to get us a little bit out of our skin, as it were, and put ourselves in the bodies, in the broader sense of that word, of everything that we live with, human and otherwise. And I think that story on what was it, Libia, your story on robots and language, and robots and insects and language, and all that was really disarming in that sense, because it's not really something that we think about, putting ourselves in like the body of an AI, and I guess connecting that then down to this question about bottom-out local action is, I think, one problem with local action is that it doesn't always lend itself to buzzwords like replicability or scalability, because a lot of times what is actual, in the words of T.S. Eliot, is only actual for one time and one place. But I think in reflecting on how we adapt methods and ideas from community to community, it's not necessarily only across space from one place to another. Sometimes it's also across time. And what the essay I wrote, The Village Within, reflects a bit on that. Like, how communities draw knowledge from the past in some ways, and bring that knowledge with us as we move around, but also in some ways how we're inspired by the future. And that might be a little bit tricky because it hasn't happened yet, but in imagining that, we draw ourselves, I think, into that future. So yeah, these are some of the kind of thoughts around that. I think stories witness to this non-linearity of time and community.
Yeah, that's a really lovely observation. And I think we all carry different futures around inside us, and we think about them and express them, whether it's through our children or through things that we write or just things that we care for because we want to preserve them for the later generations. And all of this feels like a beautiful transition, Libia, to the stories that you contributed. So maybe you'd like to go next.
Thank you. Yeah, I am thinking a lot in what Vandana said and what just Benjamin said, and also what you said earlier. I think one of the main answers maybe is that we have to work together. I have the fortune to experience this in like firsthand about writing and creating in a group with other people, and there is like a point of no return for me in my life in general, not only as a writer but as a person and as a human being that is very overwhelmed by all the horror around us, because we need hope and we have hope, and as humans, it is inevitably that we want to go forward that horror, but we need each other to do it. And it's not, I don't want it to sound naive. It's very hard work. It's very hard work because we need to think from the bottom and going extend our work. But in order to do that, we need to think without hierarchies. And that is really difficult in this environment. We are used to think in a vertical way in general, as governmental, the governed structures, societal structures. I think one of the paths may be to form small groups and from that go forward. And I think that can help us to survive as creative people, as a society, but also because things are getting worse and worse and people in power is not really changing their ways. We probably need to relate to small groups of people that connect with other small groups of people and form new ways of living and of interact with the world that is our house. So I don't know if that is like going too far from the center of the question, but to me, everything is connected because we live in a moment in which both things are certain and in parallel. On one hand is my little life as a human being, as a person, but I live in a world that is full of all these problems, and we are interconnected in a very literal way. The fact that we are in different parts of the world talking right now, it's a sample of that. So yeah, in the novelette, as a part of the Cúmulo de Tesla, we wrote this novelette working together, and it's just a small sample of things. And you can see in the text, you can see different voices and different times and different characters, and I think that is beautiful. And it's a sample that it is possible to work in a collective way and in a horizontal way. And if it's possible later, I can refer to the Ursula K. Le Guin's words that I always bring. But yeah, it's like now I'll shut up because otherwise I'll continue.
Well, there's always room for more Ursula K. Le Guin in my conversations, but I would love to ask you, Vandana, to maybe pick up from there and reflect a little bit on that idea of how climate action spreads and how we can learn, because I think Ben's point is well taken that context matters, and you can't just try to impose the same solutions, the same fixes in many different parts of the world. But what are some examples of how things can spread, how ideas can be shared? Is there a role for storytelling in all of that?
Well, there certainly are examples in the real world, and one of the things that's the elephant in the room is power structures, right? So we are kind of held to ransom by power structures in the world because we know what needs to be done. And yet, it's not just social inertia, it's also power that stands in the way. And so, which makes the job really, really difficult of communicating with stories across space and time. And yet, this is something that is happening, where communities, and in some cases, some of the most marginalized communities are taking things into their own hands. And these are people who've got their backs against the wall, and yet they are moving, they're doing things. So for example, I'll give you one small example that I know about, which is that, the Sundarbans region of India and Bangladesh, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, is hit often by cyclones, which is what they call hurricanes in that part of the world. And we know that because of sea level rise, the impacts of hurricanes are even worse usually. What happens to small farmers who live on subsistence agriculture over there is that their fields get inundated with salt water, and then they can't grow their crops anymore. And that means they face starvation, which exacerbates poverty, as we know. So what has happened is that, in this particular example, a friend of mine who helps connect the stories, literally wanders from place to place and connects people's experiences together, actually brought a woman farmer from the southern coast of India who had figured out how to rejuvenate and desalt her fields. When the 2004 tsunami hit that coast, brought her over to the Sundarbans to teach the farmers how to do the same thing in the Sundarbans. And they were successful. So this is just one example of mutual aid. And this is one of the great super strengths that our species has, that so-called ordinary people can do extraordinary things. So just one example.
It's a beautiful one. This makes me think of the role of imagination in just starting to see and become aware of the natural world and starting to see these connections, or say, realize that there might be plants or sort of natural processes that can help, say, pull the salt out of a field, right? That there are there are so many things to be known, and that the stockpile of human knowledge is not very well distributed, and we don't understand how much we've forgotten, or how much in different communities or small groups of people might know, but that information rests only with them, or hasn't been approved and authorized and blessed by power structures to say, oh well, this is real and true. And it makes me think of the urban ecology work that you've done, Ben. And one thing I took away from a project that you did with us at CSI before was, I hope I get this right, bole makantak, can we eat it? You'll have to correct me if I got that wrong, but the nature is not nature is us, and it's everywhere, and we are touching and engaging with every natural ecosystem around the planet. There's no such thing as a non-natural space, and so that the environment is there all the time, and we just have to open our eyes to it. So I wonder if this is the sort of stories that came out of that kind of urban ecology, or if you see that emerging going forward, that people are starting to change how they think about their relationship with plants, with food, as our our urban environments continue to evolve?
You know, Ed, for a moment I thought that you would be throwing that question to Libya, because as you're talking about learning from plants and other organisms, it's just again that story on robots, insects, and language and living things came to mind, because it was very much about learning, you know, what was in the histories of all these plants and animals and other species. My work does go into the realm of interspecies quite a bit, but I think, you know, when you see it in a story, it's really refreshing. A key word that comes to mind here is attentiveness, and you know, the variations of that word and what it means, and just paying attention to what's around us and being curious. I think going back to the origins of that project for the Applied Imagination Fellowship, in cities, especially in Southeast Asian cities that are growing at a really, really rapid rate, there's a sense that we can get really sucked into to kind of like our human constructed systems and just daily life, and not necessarily notice non-human elements around us. And especially during the pandemic lockdowns, when we were forced to, in many ways, be hyper-local because we couldn't move around. And I think there was a greater sense of awareness and attentiveness to what was around us, and maybe also a bit of curiosity. People were certainly, you know, planting a little bit more in the neighborhoods. And that question emerged, has always been at the back of my mind, of colleagues when I worked in the Botanic Garden. But it really came to the fore when we started to wonder, you know, could we eat these things that grow wild, and what are they actually? And it means something, I think, in the Malaysian context, because in Malaysian Southeast Asia, we're obsessed about food. But then again, I've also noticed that we don't always necessarily use food as an opening into how we think about the environment. It seems like the worlds of ecological management and nature conservation are divorced from the worlds of like food and culture and community. And I think that project was an attempt to sort of, bridge that a bit. And there's this recent project here in the UK, and a book that came out last year by Kira Chapman called Nature's Calendar, that tries to think of the British season in 72 micro seasons instead of 4 major ones. I think it's these little things, are examples from, you know, different parts of the world, about how we can reimagine our relationship with the world around us and nature in all its wildest sense.
Thank you. So I want to just remind everybody, please do drop a question using that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to, and we're going to turn to some of your questions in just a minute. But I'll ask all of you just quickly for one final comment. What are you hoping will come out of this project? What, you know, are there any, do you have any ideas or hopes for the stories that you've contributed to the book or the project as a whole? What would you like to see come out of this? And I will start with you, Libia.
Well, I hope people feel inspired, feel addressed. If they have to get angry. If they have to respond it, please. Because this is not a static thing. We tend to think that a published work is something that is like set. And it can be a living thing. Language is a living thing. And also, I think I have take a peek of the questions of a lot of people here. If you don't know how to start, if you feel overwhelmed, I think number one, find people that is keen to your interests and start discussions. So for the almanac in general, which is a wonderful work, I have not finished reading it yet, but I have read a lot of the works and I am in awe. Please read it, take your time, and also discuss it. Don't set it, don't let it be set and quiet. Talk about it, send letters, send emails, send postcards from the future. And I think that is a very good start point. And I will like to discuss more with Benjamin, for instance, and also with Vandana. And I just close with this quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, because I think it's very resonant still. She said in the acceptance speech when she received the medals for literature, the greatest prize for a writer in the United States. Hard times are coming. We will be wanting the voices of writers, and I will add, artists and scientists and people who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We will need writers, artists, scientists, people who can remember freedom, realists of a larger reality.
That's a beautiful, beautiful turn of phrase. Ben, how about you? What is something that you're hoping will come out of the project?
I hope that imagination will kind of gain, I don't want to necessarily want to say gain traction, but grow beyond sometimes the bad reputation I have as being something that's airy and something that's intangible, especially in some like more tangibility seeking circles. Because I think the best stories really go deep into our daily experience, and that reminds me of surprisingly, the one story I felt strangely connected to was Laura Watts's Stormpunk Islands, because it was about Scotland. And I'll just take a moment to I wanted to just, this is a picture of, I think, the coast near where I live, but it's not always this calmish, I mean, it's stormy as well. And never thought that and it's very different from the experience in Malaysia. But I think stories go deep into this daily experience, and context matters, but also I think some metaphors brilliantly and beautifully transcend or are relevant in other places. And Vandana's imagery of trees like grandmas huddling, and the ability of maybe glossy magazines to turn things around. Again, from Ina's dream. These are words that stick with me, and I just hope that the words will find a kind of life of their own from this collection of stories and reflections, and yeah, who knows, spark ideas and actions.
Absolutely. And Vandana, how about you?
Well, I do hope that this collection of stories and essays will help readers, will help people shake themselves out of this imagination trap that we are in, where we think about the future only as an extension of grim reality today. Because what speculative fiction allows us to do is to inhabit alternatives for a while and to feel like we are living in them for the duration of the story. And then once you're out of there, you carry the at least the shadows of that dream with you into your reality. And I have this funny thought that I would like people, if they are willing, to consider reading the stories and essays aloud to each other in groups, because reading has become such a solitary activity. And I come from a very long, ancient oral tradition, and I think it would be lovely and very, very heartening for people to sit together and take turns reading parts of the stories and essays aloud, and then see what their collective intelligence comes up with. So once we free the imagination, and we can't do it alone, that's the thing. Like, you might think a story does it, but as has been recently expressed, the reader is so important, and it doesn't have to be read silently. It can be read aloud, it can be enacted, and as we saw in the film. So yes, I would love to see this going forward in that direction.
So beautiful thoughts, and I think you've addressed in a couple of cases some of the questions people posed. Libia, you already spoke a little bit to somebody who asked, how do I get started? And this is sort of a related question, which is, what are the ideal skills involved in storytelling around climate futures? Do you need a PhD in climate science, or is this a collaboration across expertise, scientists working with artists, working with novelists? So I think you all probably have really interesting answers to this question. I'm going to pick on Ben because you're a student now. What do you think? What kind of expertise do you need?
Oh, this is a difficult one. I think you should pick on a teacher. Yeah. I don't know, expertise in terms of like, if you could narrow the question, like, how would you?
Well, I think that this is, what sort of I think the way I'm interpreting the question, this is a question that Cassidy asked, what kinds of knowledge do you need to tell climate future stories. And I will allow you, Ben, to phone a friend if you want. You could ask Vandana, because I think she would also have a good answer to this question.
I think Libia and Vandana have great answers, but maybe I'll just build on something Vandana said. There's this idea of collective intelligence.
Yeah.
I think that skill of being able to go broad, look for stories, and find them in sometimes the most unexpected of places. Would be one of the key things. As a student, and especially one doing a PhD, sometimes the risk can be the sense of tunnel vision and going a bit too deep into something. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that actually this comes back to that idea of there are many different kinds of knowledge, and you don't need to have kind of disciplinary grounding. And sometimes a deep disciplinary grounding can be a barrier to certain kinds of generalist thinking and exploring different possibilities, or you get hung up on you can only define words in certain ways. So there's something to be said for being a curious generalist and not being too deep in the trenches of a particular perspective. But let me ask another question from the audience. What are the climate futures narratives that you're most interested in exploring next? Anyone would like to volunteer for this one? Go ahead, Libia.
Well, I'm going to talk about the people that I collaborate with. There is a book that is recently published from Gabriela Damián Mirabete that is They Will Dream in the Garden. It's translated from Spanish to English, and it's published by Rosarium Publishing. You can buy it right now in English. It's translated by Adrian Demopoulos. And Gabriela Damián Mirabete won the Otherwise Award, the former known as the James Tiptree Jr. Award, which is the most important feminist science fiction award in the United States. And that story in particular, you can read in Latin American literature today, also in English and in Spanish. It's online, it's for free. The whole book, you can buy it now. And Gabriela Damián Mirabete is one of the authors here in Mexico that is a speculative writer, an imaginative and science fiction and fantasy writer. Is one of the most important in the whole country, but also it's one of the most relentless optimists in a very good way. I'm saying it bad in English, but she has a lot of hope. She's very keen with the reality, and she's very acutely aware of the world that we live in. And she's one of the contributors in the Cosmic Fire. And she's an author that is very, very, it's worth it to look for. So for all the readers that only read in English, you can look for her new book. But also, if you read in Spanish, you can download her short story book that is La Canción Detrás de Todas las Cosas, which is, the ebook is for free, and you can download it in Spanish and read it. So you can search for it, and there is a lot of people, but I just consume my time. So that is one of the recommendations that I have. I am interested in many works, and I have no time, but it's no time in life, I mean, to explore all of it. But I try to keep up with what my gut tells me.
So I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I think we did slate this to end at 15 minutes past the hour. So I'm going to pause here, but I want to thank everybody for their questions and comments, and encourage you that the Climate Action Almanac is freely available. Please feel free to share it. You can read the whole book online. Please feel free to share that video. We're very excited to have that out in the world. And please follow up, and you can explore the website of the Center for Science and the Imagination. There are a number of other free open access resources. Somebody asked about YA work, and we did do a comic book a few years ago called Arizona 2045, Drawn Futures, though there's just one little piece, and there are many other wonderful things out there. Thank you to everybody, all of our speakers today, and to everybody who helped us organize this. And thank you all for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you in the future in hope and navigating the many challenges ahead of us. Thank you all.